Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 2, Chapter 8, Section 10, Other Zisha Clay Formulation Techniques. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Zongjun Li.
Hello.
And Emily Huang.
Hi, everyone.
Let's start with some definitions for the listeners. Zongjun, what is Tiaosha?
Tiaosha essentially is, if you interpret it literally, it means mixing or blending of grains. So different types of clay, different types of grain size being blended together or mixed together in different manner is essentially what Tiaosha is.
And how does this manifest in a Yixing teapot? If a listener was listening to this, how would they know if they were looking at Tiaosha?
Generally, there are two main characteristics that you can just recognize Tiaosha immediately, both visually and texturally. So visually for Tiaosha, you would have oftentimes these very artistically designed or beautifully appeared stela image of a teapot surface, like different color of clay grains scattered across the surface of the teapot in different pattern. We will talk about how these patterns vary in terms of different method later in this podcast. When you see this type of surface on a teapot, it's usually a Tiaosha work. And of course, you have other techniques such as Chousha, which is more texture driven.
We'll talk about Chousha in one moment, but you would say that Tiaosha generally creates a spectacular grady pattern. It has highly contrasting colors of speckles embedded into a teapot or into a clay body.
That's correct.
Excellent. Emily, what is Pusha?
So Pusha in Chinese pu means layering on top of, similar to Tiaosha in the sense that it is also mixing, but it is not blending. It would be adding a different type. It could be clay or grains on top of a base type of clay.
And Zongjun, finishing the definitions with you, what is Chousha?
Chousha is essentially using different grit size of the sith to remove a medium-sized grain from a base clay. And then you have only the large size clay and the smaller grain size clay. And then you have this beautiful contrast of different polarized grain size to create this very coarse and interesting surface texture.
And so that's predominantly textural, whereas the other two techniques are predominantly visual.
That's correct.
So in summary, what each of these techniques have in common is a modification of particle sizes through the addition or removal of grains. And if it's an addition, it's often from a different Zisha material in the base clay. Do both of you agree? So that seems rather complicated as a technique, right? When did it develop? Is it an old technique?
It actually started around Ming Dynasty, and it is quite old in the sense of time period, but I would say it really started when the artists were going after a higher form of art, different shapes and colors that they want to play with to come up with a final teapot art.
Yeah, that's correct. At the same time, you also see a lot of development in terms of the artistic design of the teapot itself. These tree trunk or proto-Gongchun style teapots slowly emerge. It was at a time that people start to pay attention to the artisanal craftsmanship and the artistic value of teapot instead of teapot just being a utensil to brew tea.
Yeah. I definitely want to add to that. Ming Dynasty is also at the height of all the different poetries, arts, calligraphy, and all that. So that was also when a lot of the teapots, tea drinking, tea ceremonies were embedded into these culture.
We focused on the visual effects so far in this part of the conversation, but are the effects exclusively visual? Is there another reason that ceramic artists would add grains into the material? Is there textural properties or other types of material properties that can be modified with the Tiaosha additions?
Definitely, like one part of the Tiaosha technique is to bring certain materials such as Chousha, and in a Western term, we call it Grog, into the base clay. It's basically a bisque fire or pre-fired clay grains in a slightly lower temperature, usually around 600 to 800 degrees Celsius. And then they will add that pile of bisque-fired grain into the base clay to increase oftentimes the structural integrity of the final teapot. So especially for certain clay type that tend to slag or tend to have higher deformation rate, bringing in Chousha definitely has a lot of improvement in terms of its functional utility.
And so when using the same clay type, what's called Tiaosha, where there is no visual effect, that's predominantly about modifying texture, about increasing the strength moldability of the wares, particularly for larger wares. For Tiaosha, for Tiaosha with contrasting colors, originally when I saw these speckled wares early in my tea education, they were not to my aesthetic preference. So it took me some time before I started to find Tiaosha wares attractive and beautiful. Did you go through a similar sequence, or was this more of a Chinese or Taiwanese aesthetic? Did this immediately appeal to you, or did it take you some time going from pure colored wares to these speckled wares?
Oh, I definitely like Isa Tiaosha in the first place. The contrast of color and also just the sheer, it kind of intrigues you to want to touch it. The visual effect and the textural effect really has a thing to me in the very beginning. I don't know about you, Emily.
I have to say that I never found it unusual, the Isa Tiaosha having different color specs visually, but I never wanted to buy it or use because it seems like it's designed and produced for just observing visually. Like it should be put into a museum, not in my house.
Yeah, there is definitely a very strong kind of artistic and scholarly preference towards this type of design. Actually,
Mm.
you don't just see that in teapots. In some traditional calligraphy and traditional ink painting, people will put gold foil speckles on the paper to create a textural dynamic of the painting.
Very similar to Japan, where they use the gold dust blown through the bamboo and cloth sieve underneath the lacquer to create the gold speckles.
Yeah, or just to show people how rich you are.
Both the Yixings and the gold dust lacquer. That type of cultural and aesthetic differences is very interesting. And particularly your comment that the Tiaosha wares, the Yes Tiaosha wares, don't look to be utilitarian. They look to be artistic pieces. And that relates closely back to what you were saying about the origin of Yes Tiaosha, that this technique probably developed with the addition of grog into larger format wares as a form of texture modification. And then they realized that you could actually use a contrasting color and blend that in. And that brought it from originally a utilitarian modification of material properties to an artistic practice. I think that's a keen observation that listeners should be aware of. An interesting question rooting from that is, are there any restrictions on what grain material or the processing of the grain material that can be used for Tiaosha? Can you just use any base clay and any grains, or can you only use some combinations, or do you have to process the grains in a certain way in order to use them for Tiaosha wares?
I'll give it a start. Definitely, shrinkage rate is something that you should consider doing Tiaosha. If the shrinkage rate is too large between the base clay and the grain that you are going to blend in, you are going to have a nightmare firing those wares because the grain might fall off or it might be crushed by the base clay, forming flaws. So definitely for anyone who tend to create a Tiaosha ware from the beginning, one needs to really master the shrinkage rate of the clays that they're playing with.
What are the common flaws that can occur from a poorly formulated Tiaosha?
One of the common flaw will be, they call it 脱尾现象 or a dragon tail effect. Basically, it's when you have some soft and different colored grain inclusions in your base clay that it's not well mixed. And doing the Mingzhen process or the smoothing process, the grain might be crushed by the scraper and then getting dragged across the entire teapot and leaving a very noticeable mark, which is considered as a common flaw. And other flaws, as I mentioned before, would be the sha being blended into the base clay, having too much or too little of the shrinkage, and then end up being crushed by the base clay or fell off from the base clay, leaving marks.
My next question. Are there any natural forms of Zisha Tiaosha?
Not to our knowledge, no. So there has been some comments on a clay called Jingsha that was saying that it is more of a natural, but it actually is not. It is one of the many forms of Zuni ore. We do see different ores embedded within, but they are not actually artificially blended like what we're talking about right now.
How can you tell the difference between something like Tianqingni, which contains Lipini inclusions, versus Tiaosha? Why isn't that Tiaosha?
That is a very good question.
For Tianqingni with Lipi inclusions, definitely you are not going to have a very homogeneous distribution of Lipi. It's depending on where the Lipi is paragenesis with the Tianqingni. You sometimes have very ununiformic distribution of Lipi, which sometimes some pre-cleaning need to be done before the Tianqingni is ready to turn into a teapot for the ceramics to use. So my gut suspicion is that some ceramists in the past got inspired by this natural phenomenon and start to experiment. The end effect is definitely very different with the natural paragenesis clay versus a artificial Tiaosha.
I would say that it's mostly about appearance, that in any naturally formed blend of clay, you're going to have little tiny speckles, but the colors continue to be quite uniform. And so you're not going to have the type of radiance that Tiaosha has, that spectacular effect where the grains drastically stand out from the background clay. It's much more of an even surface visual appearance.
I have a question for you, Jason.
Go ahead.
What's your current preference of Tiaosha and how has your preference changed throughout
Now,
time?
now I do appreciate Tiaosha. And particularly, I appreciate a lot of the LEQR, the late Qing, early ROC Tiaoshas that were attempting to recreate early Ming Dynasty style wares. I think the use of really large Huang hard grains where you can actually see the grain embedded in a little pockmark. I have a teapot here that's featured in a previous chapter and referenced in this chapter where you could really see the difference in the grain. And sometimes it looks like a grain is loose. Something about it is very appealing. The little flecks of gold embedded in a nice baked zinni color. But I would say that that's a very recent acquisition of preference. I would say that before starting to write this book, I would probably have still preferred the more pure, homogeneous appearance, more common throughout Zisha clay. And I think it's also part of an increased appreciation for zinni that I've gained while writing this book. We talked about this in the last chapter, that zinni seems to be the least hyped clay, right?
Um,
And
Big old brother.
yeah, and the Tiaosha, yes, the Tiaosha is predominantly done on a zinni base with that contrasting chiffon. Yeah, it's a very new appreciation. I did not have it before starting to write this book and doing the research on this book.
Interesting. Do you find Tiaosha having different utility effect to the tea when you brewing tea with your Tiaosha collections?
So I only have a single teapot that is Tiaosha, and it's actually Pusha. So the grains are only on the surface. So there is no difference in effect from other antique zinni. I've not had much tea out of a pure Tiaosha with the fully blended grains. My assumption is that there would be relatively little effect. And the reason for that assumption is because the Tiaosha grains are generally harder so that they're not crushed, which means that they're predominantly from a denser clay. The most common is Shihuang, but they're usually one of the very firm grains. So Shihuang, Shihong, and those are not very porous or textural. So I don't think that they have a large effect. I actually, and I haven't been able to test this, I actually think that Chousha, the removal of the mid-sized particle sizes, would have by far the largest effect on the tea because the removal of those grains accentuates surface texture. And my theory, which we'll write extensively about in the book with some experimental tests and designs, is that it's really surface texture that's controlling the variations in extraction brew rate, acting as either a catalyst or a nucleation point or a dampener. And hypothetically, in theory, it should be Chousha that has the largest magnitude of effect. And I think it's a much larger magnitude of effect.
Oh, very interesting. This probably might be our next batch of commission.
Side by side, normal and Chousha.
Right.
Our friend is going to think that we're crazy. Right, Jason, let's do another triplet set. Oh, that would be fun. Yeah, one of each. We would like to do a Tiaosha, a Pusha, and a Chousha and see how it affects the tea. It would have to be a 4-part set, right? Because we would need the base clay as well.
Matrix is just getting larger and larger.
Yeah, we're all going to have a lot of deep thoughts. All right, my last question. Emily, who is Admiral Grog? They can't hear you laughing. You are on mute.
It's okay. Okay. Admiral Grog was a British Royal Navy, and apparently his name was used for a very common lemon alcohol drinks in the Caribbean.
Yeah, that's approximately.
Alcohol?
Yeah, alcoholic. It's a
Rum punch, yeah.
Why
So
is- why is-
British Caribbean rum punch that was named after Admiral Grog.
and
I've
what-
never heard that before, this book.
Have you ever spent time in the British Virgin Islands drinking rum
Of
punch?
course not.
Okay, you have your honeymoon planned for you right there.
The Caribbeans for some grog.
Zongjun, why is this relevant to the chapter? Why is there a long footnote about Admiral Grog?
Yeah, starting from Ming Dynasty, exchange between the British Empire and China has greatly intensified, and the scholarly community developed this preference of drinking rum out of Pusha teacup. I'm totally joking.
Rum, good to the last drop. What did Admiral
That's
Grog
awesome.
have to do with the ceramics technique of adding grog, fired clay, back into an unfired ware?
Nothing.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's just an unfortunate divergence of names.
Unfortunately, does not. But do you have any idea of where the name came from, Jason?
The actual semantic origin of grog? No. I think grog at some point was a term for sand, but I'm not 100% sure of that.
It has definitely nothing to do with the drink or Admiral Grog from the
It's
British
more
Navy.
likely to have sand in your rum punch in the BVIs. Everyone, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you for joining us of this edition in Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for our next conversation, Construction of Yixing Teapots.